No worries. Kia ora, everyone. Grüß Gott. I'm for once not calling in from the future in Aotearoa, New Zealand, but from Austria. I'm visiting my family, and I'm very excited to get to talk to you again about the hard to reach energy users task. As Sam said, we have just begun a second phase of the task. Overall, we're calling it Achieving a Just Energy Transition. And particularly, we want to focus on hidden energy users, and that's what this webinar is about. Very quickly, just up front, that I need to say that the users TCP and this task are functionally and legally autonomous from the IEA Secretariat. So the views and findings that I'm talking about here do not necessarily reflect those of the IEA. The talk outline, I'm going to give a very quick background to the hard to reach task, or the HTR task. I'm going to talk a little bit about energy equity and justice and the energy trilemma. I'm going to give some quick lessons from phase 1 because they inspired phase 2. I'm going to talk about hidden energy users, and then I'm going to give some examples from field research. And then, of course, we have the Q&A. So why are we talking about energy equity? Well, I am probably the eminence grise old dame of this users TCP. I've been around for almost 13 years. I started in the IEA DSM, which is what it was called before, with behavior change in DSM. We did that to see if there is like a specific behavior change model or discipline or approach that was particularly better than others, and realized no behavior change silver bullets, like there are no technology or market silver bullets, but that it really was about achieving a collective impact. And that really led us into working on multi-stakeholder collaboration and changing the behaviors of the behavior changes, really, not just of the energy end users. And then we realized that was working quite well, but then we realized that we were kind of missing out on a whole bunch of energy users. And so we started the hard to reach energy users task. The shared goal was to identify, define, and prioritize hard to reach audiences, design, measure, and share effective strategies to engage those audiences to achieve energy demand response and climate targets whilst meeting access, equity, and energy service needs. So we were already focused on equity. All the countries that participated in that task were really keen on that. And we hypothesized that it was about 30% of energy users that were hard to reach, and then kind of found to our dismay that it was at least 2/3, if not 3/4, particularly once you expand into the residential and non-residential commercial sector, where, the focus has been, unfortunately, on the majority of energy users not necessarily being captured by the current programs. What we then learned after 3-4 years actually of that task was that there is a subsegment of the hard to reach energy users, which are the so-called hidden energy users, and we really want to focus in more on that and actually make them the priority focus, particularly if we want to achieve a just energy transition. So our definition of how to reach energy users is broad on purpose. It's an energy user from the residential or commercial sectors who uses any type of energy or fuel, who's typically either hard to reach physically, underserved, or hard to engage and motivate in behavior change, energy efficiency, and demand response interventions that are intended to serve our mutual needs. Most people immediately think of these hard to reach energy users as low-income households who live in energy poverty, but it's a lot more complex than that. Vulnerable households are obviously not just those who are low income, but those who suffer from various intersectionalities. They're also high income energy users, commercial and residential renters, and the landlords, and especially small and micro businesses, all of which are hard to reach for different reasons. And you can see here in the graph of a big survey that we did of our countries at the start of our hard to reach task that the users are quite broad. We also wrote a book characterizing hard to reach energy users, where we reviewed over 1,000 pieces of literature, which also showed us that these are very broad and deep as well. So if we're talking about energy justice, first up, obviously a lot of you will know this, especially if you work in the energy justice or energy poverty space, but it's really important that we don't equate energy equality with equity with justice. Energy equality is really around evenly distributed tools and assistance, but that doesn't account for structural and systemic inequalities. Energy equity refers to the creation of custom tools to address those inequalities, but energy justice focuses on fixing the system and providing people with the tools they need to have equal access to opportunities. And that's really what we want to achieve when we're talking about a just transition. So the energy trilemma is really about the understanding that trying to formulate energy policy is really complex. The current clear conceptual example of this complexity is this energy trilemma, where we have the constant competing forces of the economics, which are around affordability, but obviously also profit, the environment, which are around sustainability, obviously also like waste, and particularly the greenhouse gas and carbon implications, and politics, which is around security, but also access. There is no perfect solution, but what society can and should aspire to is that we achieve a better balance between these three competing aims of energy policy. And to date, unfortunately, society has focused more on the economics to the detriment, particularly of the environment, but also of society. And the wars in Ukraine and Middle East have really put energy security back in the spotlight. So that meant that coal output was rising. That impacted our decarbonization efforts. Then the energy prices have increased, which increased energy poverty and hardship. And all of those had those compounding factors lead to the energy crisis, which really was one of competing priorities. So what we and some other people are arguing is that it is actually a quadrilemma, which adds the fourth element, which is the social dimensions of energy that focuses on people, their involvement, the acceptance of decisions in the energy industry, and that concerns itself with providing energy in a just, democratic, and sustainable way. And that is generally referred to as energy justice. And it's concerned with identifying when and where energy injustices occur in energy systems and how best law and policy and programs can respond. And that's often conceptualized as having three principal tenets around distributional justice, procedural justice, and recognition justice, although I'll give an example of another one in a second. And it deals both with the macro justice on the societal impacts of energy and how fair and just the institutional decisions are, as well as the micro justice, which is how individuals are impacted by the systemic outcomes. And what we'd argue is that instead of looking at it as four equally distributed kind of stools of this energy quadrilemma, we should really look at it at the energy trilemma through an energy justice lens with all the decisions that we make when we design policies and programs. So we're getting more and more and more towards this kind of outcome. The global trends on energy equity and justice are quite strong. The IEA obviously is talking about the fact that you need to put people and inclusivity at the center of all clean energy transitions. At COP28, the decision by almost 200 countries that they signed on was obviously that a shift away from fossil fuels should happen in a just, orderly, and equitable manner. And then, for example, the Biden administration, the White House, created the Justice 40 initiative, where hundreds of federal programs were transformed across the government to put underserved and disadvantaged communities at the center and prioritize them. And then the Equity and Energy Initiative from the Department of Energy in the US similarly focuses on underserved communities. And obviously there's a lot of programs in Europe and the EU that focus on energy poverty and energy communities in particular. And on the bottom there are just some examples of it. So why do we need to focus on energy equity? Well, the call for justice in the energy sector has arisen primarily because we haven't managed the sector that well, because there has been too much of a focus on the economics, and that obviously then fed through how the policy was applied through law. The primary focus, which was on economic growth and efficiency and competition and costs, hasn't really worked so well on the environmental and the social sides of the energy sector. And even in the case of law, it really was only in the last few years that the definition of energy law, for example, has included the issue of waste management. Neoclassical economics still reigns the thinking in the energy sector. That meant we kind of had an over-influence of technology and an underinvestment and lack of understanding in the human side of energy use, which we're slowly starting to change with the focus, for example, on behavior change. Obviously, we continue to fund fossil fuels with subsidies, $7 trillion US a year. That doesn't account for the externalities from fossil fuels. And we've known, at least since the Stern report, but obviously even before that, that the climate crisis is actually the greatest energy-related externality of all time. So we need to change these dynamics and have a paradigm shift there. There could be a discussion if energy should be a market commodity instead of a universal human right and basic public good. We still have almost 750 million people who do not have any access to the electricity system in the world. And, the energy system in general is quite Eurocentric, and issues around colonization and decolonization, which I'll focus on just for a second as well to make it clear what this is about. Benjamin Sovacool in particular has written quite a lot about this. And one of the things that he's shown is that this also shows through in energy research, there has been an overabundance of funding that has gone to the science and engineering and economics disciplines, and very little in comparison to the social sciences. There has also been an overabundance of male authors compared to female authors, of quantitative compared to qualitative investigations, and of course, Europe and North America are almost the entirety of energy research funding and energy research where it comes from. And we need to change that if we really want to have a just global energy transition. So with all of that, is a just energy transition really possible? I'd argue not under the current economic and socio-political system. So we do need a paradigm shift where human and environmental justice do trump that profit thinking at all costs. And it obviously means that we need to look at key concerns in the field, which are around issues of access. As I said, we still have almost 1 billion people in the world that don't have access to the electricity system, around distribution of harms, around the fairness of decision-making to ensure that decisions do not infringe on human rights and civil liberties, and also around democracy and informed participation. But what's happening right now, and you probably heard these terms, is that we have this incredibly complex, messy, both polycrisis and a permacrisis. So we have a crisis that means several catastrophic events are unfolding at the same time, like the climate crisis, the ecosystem collapse, several wars that impact our energy systems, plus energy poverty, energy crisis, etc. And then there is some of it has become a permacrisis, which is basically an extended period of this instability. And they're all interconnected, as you can see from this global risks landscape by the World Economic Forum. The World Energy Council is also using the energy trilemma to rank countries as to how well they're balancing those different policy aims. And this is really just to say that, for example, Sweden and New Zealand rank both in the top 10. There are two countries that are contributing to this task, and both of them, do have some things that are great and some things that are problematic as well when we're talking about energy justice. Sweden particularly, has really low energy poverty. It's the lowest in the EU, but since the war in Ukraine especially, it has high dependency on energy imports. That meant that some of those prices that shifted really impacted lower and middle income groups. They had to give emergency support to energy producers and consumers. And there are issues in the energy transition around marginalization of underserved communities. There are also, discussions always where you have indigenous populations around where renewables are situated, especially if they're in areas of indigenous sovereignty, and sometimes there can be bad outcomes for the environment. And Aotearoa New Zealand, which has really high renewables and is obviously an independent, self-sufficient energy system because it's an island at the end of the world, but we have really bad housing crisis. We have the worst housing stock in the OECD. We've built the fewest homes, the most expensive rents, highest proportion of stressed renters. They're more likely to experience energy hardship. There's a large percentage of houses that can't actually, like almost 10%, that can't afford to keep the home adequately warm, and that particularly affects our indigenous Maori and Pacifica populations. Here's just some examples, if you're interested, of some other countries around energy injustice and energy poverty, including remote indigenous populations in Australia. So some lessons from our first phase were that it is important how you define things. You need to go beyond simple income-related definitions and metrics. Otherwise, you're not reaching the majority of energy users. are they really trying? Are they really hard to reach, or are we not trying to reach them hard enough? We need to embrace complexity, especially with different audiences. They have different barriers, motivations, needs, strategies, and solutions, which means we need to spend more resources better to deeply understand those different subsegments and make them priority audiences instead of ignoring them. That means we have to look at the hidden segments, which is what I'm going to talk about in the next 10 minutes, why they're hidden. Are we not seeing them? Do they want to remain hidden on purpose? Why so? These are questions that we have hardly answered yet or even asked. And that means that really understanding the lived experience better and the complex range of issues they're dealing with, and co-design with them and those community navigators and gatekeepers who do understand the lived experience. So the question is that we all need to ask ourselves, from whom aren't they hidden? There are lots of people and organizations out there who do know exactly who those energy users are, but they usually act as their gatekeepers because there's similar trust issues. And so creating those trusted relationships with those community navigators is really important, but they're also extremely hard to reach, and they're often overburdened already. And so us asking them to do more and provide us with data and with information and with stories, etc., and access to vulnerable people they're looking after for different reasons than energy and housing really just causes more issues. So it needs to be done really carefully. That also means that we do have to decolonize, re-indigenize the way we think about things. Do we really understand those marginalized communities? Do we understand how they want to be engaged with? And, it just means that we need to actually reach out and just do some listening and figure out what the right cultural approaches, messengers, and strategies are. And it may not be us. And just very quickly, because there's often confusion about decolonization, what it means is undoing the effects of colonialism, which is really just the practice or policy of control by one people over other people or areas. It doesn't just apply to former colonies or colonizers. It doesn't necessarily or exclusively apply to indigenous or independence movements. It's rather about the decolonization of knowledge, i.e. that hegemony of Eurocentric knowledge systems that I was talking about in that slide by Benjamin Sovacool, where the research funding goes, showed really well. When you address energy injustice, when you want a truly just transition, you do have to account for indigeneity, race, gender, other intersecting inequities, and that, means when you're looking at Indigenous energy justice, that moves actually beyond that idea of recognition, distributive, and procedural justice practices, and looks at restorative justice, which is necessary for its realization. And that really embodies Indigenous natural laws, relationality, kinship, to bring together human and more than human, non-human relations in healing. And that really should be included in the just transition. And that's what we're trying to do, for example, with our next task workshop in Boston. So what we're planning with phase 2, our research questions are looking at what steps are currently being taken towards a just energy transition, who the main actors are, which interventions have worked, which haven't, what may have been some of the unintended consequences of well-intentioned efforts to move to more equitable energy transitions, especially by engaging those priority audiences that I've been talking about, and how we can learn lessons to avoid any such unintended consequences, who those hard-to-reach energy users are who choose to remain or are purposefully hidden, or who are living in hidden hardship, who the navigators and intermediaries are who they have trusted relationships with, and how we can improve our approaches to engaging them, and what the cultural and country differences and similarities are when we're identifying and engaging those hidden energy users in the field. So when I'm talking about hidden energy users, it took me a time to figure out how energy hardship and hard to reachness kind of corresponded. And I realized that we all realized that it really wasn't about low income necessarily, especially there could be low income people that, own their own homes. And as soon as you have assets, you're in a better place than, renters, for example. But it really was about those who are currently hidden or do not show up on the radar of current programs and policy approaches. So the outermost circle here include those squeezed middle income households who don't own assets like property and are feeling the sting right now. They could be hidden for several reasons psychologically, because they can't admit yet that they're becoming basically the working poor. That makes them hard to reach for community groups who help the poor behaviorally, because they'd rather reduce heating or make other adjustments, such as switching providers or going on prepay, or even asking family and friends to help them pay bills before they go into debt. So that makes them hard to reach for the industry, because they still pay their bills, and then also financially, because they're very likely ineligible for most benefits and support because their income is higher than the eligibility criteria, which makes them hard for government and social service agencies. But who we really want to focus on is those really marginalized, stigmatized, and criminalized and illegalized groups. And we have tried to start pulling them apart into subsegments just to be able to study them a bit better. We did hear from the community navigators who are working with those groups that they would prefer to not put them into boxes, and I totally understand it, because there's a lot of intersectionalities. They are usually not just one of these things. There's a lot of things that interact and compound vulnerabilities. A lot of them are low income, a lot of them are renters, and a lot of them are, in one or several of those kind of intersecting circles. However, they all obviously should have a basic human right to access affordable and secure and sustainable energy, but very often they don't. And so some of them want to remain hidden on purpose. And that's what we need to really ask ourselves, and what we really want to delve very deeply into in this task is understanding why they are hidden. Is it because they have been deprioritized or are simply not on anyone's radar? For example, home-based micro businesses are barely studied, or there's hardly any programs that are targeting them. We don't even know how many of them there are. The transitory homeless fall into that. 95% of the homeless are not chronically homeless, so they do use energy, but there are very few programs that directly target them. It could be because they don't want to be a burden on society. Our research has shown that bereaved elderly or isolated elderly really fall into that. Also, recent refugees or immigrants. It could be because they're technologically, geographically, or socially isolated. For example, remote communities, indigenous communities, the elderly, disabled. It could be because they haven't acknowledged becoming the working poor. That's those kind of non-asset holding squeezed middle, which may be middle to high income even, but because they're renters and the cost of living and inflation has increased more than incomes have, they are struggling. Because the industry may only know the customer, i.e. the bill payer, but not the amount of energy users within a household. So if they live in overcrowded conditions with lots of energy consumers, like student flatters who we found in New Zealand, to a large percentage live in quite extreme poverty, or large Pacifica families, for example, the industry may not know about how many people are actually living in the household. Or they may choose to remain hidden on purpose, for example, because there has often been multi-generational trauma, distrust, fear, shame, stigma, past negative experiences with government or industry bodies, and then, of course, that includes all those criminalized or illegalized groups. There may be other reasons. So if you can think of any, please put them in the chat, or obviously if you have questions in the Q&A, but I'm really interested in exploring this issue in particular further. So now, very quickly, some insights that we've gained from field research that we've done. We've done some field research for industry in New Zealand for the two largest electricity retailers, generator retailers, and that really inspired this phase of the task. So we did a big literature review, we did workshops with almost 100 community groups and others, government, industry, researchers, and middle actors as well, who, for example, install installation. We surveyed the community organizations specifically about hidden energy users. We did interviews with the frontline customer care staff of those utilities, and we also did empathy interviews with energy users who lived in hidden hardship, who the community navigators were kind enough to introduce us to. And what we identified was 4 major themes. The biggest theme was around trust. The most important theme, it's very hard to build it once it's lost. Listening to the community voice is very important. for industry and government as well, knowing when to stay in your lane and using your power to enhance the community mana means respect or status, rather than, just quickly coming to top-down fixes and not including the community voice, and then having those mana or respect, power enhancing practices within your organizations and understanding, like the relationships, building the relationships, having cultural competency, ensuring that there's empathy training for anyone who's working on the front line, for example. So around trust, as I said, building broken trust is hard and takes time. It means also that we've got to be comfortable to be uncomfortable. And, we've got to agree that alleviating human suffering really should be as, if not more important, as selling energy. And it really helps to have familiar faces in the community. When industry is out there helping during emergencies, like with extreme weather events, etc., that's really appreciated by the community. And when you are looking at what engagement strategies works best for those who know where those hidden energy users are, the one that industry usually uses, or also government for programs, usually uses to approach people, which is via email or websites. Websites don't even show up there. They're really low on, on the radar for those groups. You really need to build those personal relationships and trusted relationships. You need to be referred, but whānau means families. So like having relationships with families that are willing to then refer other family members, other community providers, like going to social gatherings and talking to them directly, is really important. That community voice needs to be heard before we can even make any decisions around a just energy transition, however, because their resources are so overstretched, they're often not heard. We may try and consult them, but that's not co-design. And, that often means that the vast majority of them are still left out of, our decision making. And there really is a lack of accessibility for community voices. They do not have an equal voice right now. Here are examples in New Zealand of what had worked well, which are various government programs that specifically focus on elevating the community voice and educating communities in energy literacy, etc. And I'll give an example of one of those government programs that we have done as well as a pilot for our task. There is a lot of hardship that is invisible to industry and government, but industry and government has data and power that the community groups don't have. And it's really about valuing the community expertise just as much as the corporate or, policy expertise. It's knowing when to get out of the way and help when it's needed, and supporting the community to do what they do best in the way that they do best. And that sometimes means that we need to not put so much onerous burdens on when we, for example, fund community things, that they don't have to fill out a million complex paperwork or provide KPIs or do evaluations that they don't have the resources or capacity or capability to do, but actually make it easy and trust them that they know how to distribute money to help those in needs the most. And the industry in New Zealand is now starting to do that, which is really great. They have started developing pilots and programs where they're specifically doing that, based on this research, which is awesome. When you look at when we asked what they think the main reasons are that energy users want to remain hidden from authorities like industry or government agencies, whakama, which is Māori for shame, stigma, guilt, embarrassment, is by far the highest reason. And that is a really big barrier. And we need to appreciate that. And a lot of empathy needs to be put into how we approach this to overcome it. Difficulties understanding around literacy, either or language. Fear is a really big one. Fear of being evicted, fear of being disconnected, not wanting to be a burden. I already mentioned that. Over 55% mentioned that as a main reason. Not wanting the family to know. That's a really big one. What's really interesting is that not a single one of those community groups said that they think it's because it's only temporary. If you would look at the hidden energy users that are like, for example, in those big shared overcrowded student flats who live in energy poverty, or those squeezed middle income energy users, I assume that, and we need to do the research, but I assume that they would think much more likely that it's only temporary and it will, it's just a bad phase and it will be better, for example, when they finish their studies and start earning. So the hidden hardship research pilot that we did for government, we used that support for energy education and communities fund that I mentioned before. We looked at home energy assessment toolkits that we've started with Task 24 years ago in 2017 in Ireland and Aotearoa, New Zealand, and all around the world. But we wanted to make them better so that they specifically actually work for hidden energy users, so they're not just loaned out from libraries, but that you're actually collecting the data, you're providing a lot of in-home advice, and you're really taking them on a behavior change journey that takes 2 weeks, where they're every day they're doing activities with those tools and play games with their kids, and there's quizzes and there's stories, and it's quite a big intervention package that we designed. We co-designed it with community navigators and technical advisors. And we collected a lot of qualitative and quantitative data so we could really deeply evaluate the success. And it was really successful because we got 100% completion rate. That meant that every family filled in all 2 weeks of the daily activities, received the full $500 tailored price package that we pulled together. 92% said 4 months after that they'd recommend the heat kit to others or have already recommended it. 85% reported significant improvements in the home. 90% said the bills were lower. 70% said they were lower than more than $50 a month, which was in summer. So that was incredible because that is a big change for those people, for those families. 85% were still thinking about energy efficiency. 65% said other household members were too. And we could even measure with the measurements they took themselves that the average bedroom temperatures rose and the average humidity dropped over the 2-week period that they were using the tools. And it was so successful, we actually got a second phase funded, which we're starting next month. What we also did as part of this task, and this is the last bit that I'm going to mention, is we went out at the start of this new phase to energy poverty experts around the world. We did a survey. We almost got 100 responses. This is going to inform the first year of our phase 2 research, and then this workshop in Boston that I'm talking about, where we want to elevate the community and Indigenous voice. And a report on unintended consequences in the just transition, which is going to come out later in the year, are the next steps. So when we asked these experts what form their energy equity or justice work takes, the majority of them said it was in the program space. So a lot of them would have been, industry participants. And then about the other, majority worked in that policy, legislation, regulation, mandate space. The 17 or 18% who said other mostly worked in the research space. And the specific topics that they were looking to address was obviously reaching hard to reach groups, but also looking at demand flex and flexible energy use. Keeping homes comfortable was really high up there, making energy bills manageable, giving people back control, defining energy poverty, because there is still quite a lot of definition issues that are coming up between countries and even in countries. Aotearoa, New Zealand, for example, defined it as energy hardship as being the opposite of energy well-being, and designed metrics around it. Making buildings more eco-friendly, tackling energy inequality, energy solutions for Indigenous communities specifically, and also providing hands-on help in the community. When we asked them who they think is most affected by hidden hardship, they still ranked low income and the energy poor first, followed by homeless, and then single parents and pregnant women, and home-based micro businesses were actually ranked lowest overall. And when we asked what percentage of energy users they estimated would choose to remain hidden, the vast majority of respondents estimated 30% or less, but that was because our Swedish respondents with a vast majority chose less than 15% because they have such low energy poverty, and so that result was a bit skewed. When we excluded the Swedish respondents, it actually came down to 62% who estimated 30% or less. When we asked why they chose the options, of who is most hidden, they said things like historical injustices against Indigenous communities, the difficulty for children and ill people to speak up for themselves, the public perception, which may unfairly view certain groups as undeserving, for example, those criminalized or legalized groups that I was talking about earlier, that research focuses often on specific groups like low income or renters. That is true. We found that for sure ourselves. For example, high income really is under-researched and needs more research because there's obviously a lot of opportunity in that space, and they're hard to reach for very different reasons. Because financial barriers prevent fuel poor households from accessing programs, living conditions are bad. Marginalized groups also face legal barriers to accessing support. We found that as well. Personal experiences can shape how we prioritize these issues, which means that if we don't have the lived experience, we do not think of these groups. So we may just ignore them because they are not actually popping up. Evidence shows that certain groups are particularly vulnerable and lack agency, and they are rarely included in the processes and decisions, but are obviously affected by the consequences in unpredictable ways. And also, if you're alone and isolated, you're more vulnerable. So some of the conclusions from the research to date, this is my last slide, Sam. Recognizing and addressing the structural reasons and barriers that cause energy injustice is really important. We need to go beyond band-aid solutions and just sending the ambulance to the bottom of the cliff and actually stop people from falling off the cliff in the first place. That means that we need to take an equity or justice lens to our programs and processes and check for unintended consequences or negative impacts on marginalized energy users. We need to focus on reach out and listen to marginalized communities. We need to build and strengthen those trusted relationships to co-design, actually co-design and co-deliver tailored solution with the navigators. That also means sometimes knowing when we need to butt out and let them do it themselves and just support them. We need to improve energy system literacy amongst the energy users and communities because it's really low and it causes a lot of those problems. And the more complex interventions we throw at them, like demand flex, demand management, like all these technology solutions, like people don't even know what kilowatt hours are or how the energy system works in the first place. We can't expect them to know how to, follow those kind of market or tariff responses. Without educating them first. We need to provide flexible funding that they can distribute to areas of need the way they see fit. And we need to listen to and learn from Indigenous and community voices. What's also important is what they are telling us is that we need to tell our stories better of what we're already doing to support them, because a lot of the time they don't even know what's out there. And so, yeah, that's it. Please join us and work with us, engage in our research. I'm looking forward to having a chat with you now. Ask any questions, contact me, and I will hand over to Sam for his spiel.